So great to have you all on this webinar today. Mission Critical, What Next for Engaging Communities in the Clean Energy Transition. My name is Hayden Banks. I am the Advocacy Manager at Climate Outreach, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. I am delighted to be joined by two brilliant panelists for this webinar. We've got Lucy Holdaway, who is the director at the Local Storytelling Exchange, which is an organisation with a network of journalists across the country finding the stories of the clean energy transition. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Becca Massey-Chase, and Becca is the head of citizen engagement at the influential think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research. A couple of housekeeping points before we start. We'll have about 25 to 30 minutes of presentations from myself and the other two panelists before we move to questions. You should be able to see at the bottom of your screen an option to put in questions, a Q&A function. So please, while the speakers are presenting, please do add your questions into the chat and the Q&A function, and we'll try and answer those at the end. We should have about 30 minutes for questions at the end as well. So I'm going to kick us off then for the first 10 to 15 minutes and discuss.
Sorry, before you get into it, could you present, put your screen wider if you press present, because it's currently quite narrow on the screen.
Sorry, is that better?
Yes, much better.
Oh, sorry, everyone. Yeah. So I am going to lead for the first 10 to 15 minutes on Climate Outreach's research on public attitudes to renewable energy and how do we improve our engagement on the clean energy transition. So we know that we are in a real race now to meet the government's 2030 target for a fully decarbonised electricity system. And there's much discussion in the media and in policy circles around how we reach this target, and the government is making good progress towards meeting this target. But one of the things that we're primarily concerned about in this webinar is how do we bring communities with us? How do we not only communicate the benefits of this transition and communicate the vision that we're trying to achieve, but also how do we increase our engagement on the vital components of the energy transition, not just renewables, but also the real nuts and bolts of this transition, the grid infrastructure, battery energy storage systems, and the whole range of infrastructure that we need to fully electrify our energy system. It's a huge challenge, and we know that it's something that we can only achieve if we bring people with us and we really communicate the benefits of this transition. So at Climate Outreach, we do a lot of work thinking about this and how do we engage with people. So we commissioned a piece of research from Regen, which is an organisation with expertise in the planning system, to really understand what practices developers in particular were undertaking in terms of engagement activities, consultations, surveys, citizens' assemblies, range of kind of methods that practitioners are using. We really wanted to understand that a bit better before we kind of got into this and kind of unpick like what practices developers are undertaking. So why did we do this as well? I think, it's fair to say that, as I probably will be familiar to people on this call, we are in a real battleground at the moment, and we know that media coverage on net zero can be increasingly hostile. I've just put here some headlines really from different media outlets and different organisations about the real kind of nuts and bolts of the transition, people feeling that maybe the transition is imposing infrastructure and renewable energy projects onto communities without people feeling listened to. You can see there a study also from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, which found that coverage of net zero now is really also being divorced from actually discussion of climate change. So we know that we're in this really polarizing kind of moment. However, despite that, the government is also signalling that they do understand that this is an engagement challenge. You'll see there on the right-hand side a copy of the government's Energising Britain strategy, which came out at the end of last year. And that was really a signal from government that they understand that doing engagement on the transition is not just an afterthought. It needs to be really central to the transition. And there was a series of commitments in that strategy around an annual event where they would showcase kind of good climate and engagement practices happening. There was a real commitment to involve young people in the transition as well, and to inform policy. So we know that this context is increasingly hostile in our media coverage, but there is this real clear commitment from government to put resource and kind of political capital behind engagement on the renewable energy transition. So also, before I get into the research, I do just want to remind us that our latest research at Climate Outreach on public attitudes, which we've called Britain Talks Climate and Nature, which you'll probably be familiar with, and you can find it on our website, shows that people are actually really positive about renewables, despite this polarizing landscape on net zero. About 67% of us are proud, in particular, of our solar and wind energy and the progress that we're making there. And actually, even amongst voters leaning towards parties who are perhaps not as supportive in their platform of net zero, it's a healthy 74% of Reform and Tory voters who are either positive or fairly neutral about wind farms, for example. So despite the hostile media coverage, there is a real strength of support for renewable energy. And crucially, people want to be consulted and engaged on the transition. There is really low trust at the moment, but we found in our research that people favour more engagement, not less. So we know that actually about half of people think that consultation exercises that governments, developers, local authorities undertake think are just a kind of tick box exercise. People very skeptical that their views will actually be taken into consideration and reflected on, and sort of projects amended based on that feedback. About 70% of people we found think that government should listen more to people when developing renewable energy projects, even if it slows down the process. So I think, we are at this point where, the political pressure is such that government are focused on delivery and the speed of the transition, but we have to remember that there is this appetite to be consulted on and for people to feel like they have a stake in the decisions that are being made. 42% of people really want personalized responses from developers. When they've taken the time to do a consultation, they really do want that personalized engagement to show that their views are being taken into consideration. And actually, about 64% of people think that local residents are not consulted enough. So that we can't overstate the importance of doing this engagement. So what did we find from this research that we commissioned from Regen? The key findings really were that it's actually not about how much engagement you do, it's the depth and the quality of that engagement. I think there's often a feeling that this is very intensive, both financially and kind of from an employer perspective, about the time that's taken to do this engagement activity, but actually doing it well and doing it thoroughly and effectively is more important than just repeating the amount of consultations that you're doing. Communicating the purpose of this is vital as well. So I'll come on to this a bit more, but people are really put off if this just is presented as a regulatory exercise or as something that the developers are required to do. People need to know that their feedback will be taken into consideration and that projects will be amended accordingly. And then finally, there is disparity between the different types of technologies that we're talking about in the transition, and the context that we're operating in as well may shape the kind of engagement that you're able to do, whether you have kind of quite vocal opposition and the range of stakeholders that you're able to consult with. So just a quick snapshot on some of the findings. Smaller projects are actually doing better on engagement. So those generating under 5 megawatts of electricity actually came out more favourably in terms of their engagement score for this research piece. perhaps understandably, obviously if it's a smaller scale wind turbines or solar farms, perhaps that's understandable given that the range of people that you need to consult within the community might be lower. So there's a case to be made for developers thinking about these larger projects, what kind of engagement activities they can be doing at a much larger scale that might not be happening at the moment. Communicating the purpose is absolutely vital, as I mentioned. So if people feel like this is just something that is being imposed on them, if they feel like the engagement, as I've said, is just a tick box exercise, then people will really likely disengage and kind of ignore this consultation efforts. People need to understand that their feedback and their engagement will actually be taken into account when the project is ongoing and decisions are being made. And developers and local authorities really need to show that this feedback, show tangibly that this is being taken into account and projects are being amended accordingly. And when Regen told us that battery storage systems actually were less likely to be appealed in this sample that we had than solar farms and onshore wind. But when they were appealed, actually, it became apparent that developers had much less engagement experience than perhaps solar and onshore wind. So battery storage, obviously essential in the transition, but there is, from this kind of fairly small scale research piece that we did from respondents from about 39 developers on different projects, actually it was the battery storage projects that when they were appealed, there was much less evidence that they were undertaking thorough engagement activities to engage the community. So obviously a lot of attention on this in places like the east of England. We've seen the Mayor of Greater Lincolnshire, Andrew Jenkins, reject some proposals for battery storage systems because of kind of risks of fire. So really important that those kind of technologies are not neglected in our engagement as well. Some lessons then for the future and for both kind of local authorities and developers in doing this effectively. Really personalized and small scale engagement is essential to building trust. As we've seen from that data that I presented, we are in a real era of very low trust at the moment. And people feeling very skeptical about government interventions. So really trying to bring this back to the local level and small scale engagement, door to door, community hall to community hall, is absolutely vital. Use of visual and interactive tools is also really welcome. I think there was a feeling that people felt that even if they didn't agree, they really appreciated the efforts that were made to visualize what a renewable project could look like, what a wind farm could look like from their windows, and people value that kind of interactive experience. Remembering that there is often a vocal minority to renewable projects, and there can often be quite organised kind of opposition in local contexts, but reaching beyond this will improve your engagement efforts. So just to close my section before we move to the other speakers, I've got some quotes here to kind of demonstrate what people sort of told us in this research. So you can see here on the kind of personalized sort of small scale engagement, people saying that things like, even if they didn't didn't agree with the project and the final outcomes, they really did feel like actually if there were dedicated meetings with kind of street by street in community halls, then they felt like there was a real genuine effort made to build trust and incorporate people's feedback. And engaging with a wider variety of groups in the community as well. You can see there people appreciating visiting kind of local cricket clubs, social clubs. There's a huge range of things developers could be doing to really embed themselves within the community. You can see here a really positive feedback on use of 3D models and kind of exhibitions and interactive tools as well to visualize the transition. And this is something that we know a lot of kind of local authorities are starting to do. There's a really interesting project that Nesta have worked on where they've brought kind of iPads into community halls as well to really, and given iPads to members of the community to show them in a real visual way what developments will look like. And this point around reaching beyond this kind of vocal minority. So there's often these kind of groups will make themselves known to the developers of projects or different kind of renewable, and there's a sense that we can't just be listening to that group because they will often come to us, whereas actually it's the silent majority that we really need to kind of try and reach out to and engage with. We wanted also to understand and kind of showcase that there's a real economic argument for this as well. So if this is not a nice to have, this engagement, and actually the risks, the economic costs of not doing it in terms of delays and kind of costs of appeals and oppositions can be really quite high. So kind of opposition was the second most cited delay factor, and that has slowed down a lot of projects that aren't doing this engagement well by over 12 months. And we're seeing this as a real investment, and this responsive engagement, this two-way process has, we've seen from this research, contributed to avoiding delays that are ultimately costing staff time and project resources, when actually if this was done well from the beginning and there was this responsive process from the beginning, much less likely to kind of go to appeal. And just reiterating that final point, this isn't just about the number or the quantity of the engagement. We shouldn't feel like this has to be that onerous and keep repeating all these exercises, but doing it well in consulting a wide range of stakeholders, the quality of that engagement really, really vital. So I'm going to stop there now, and I think that's over to Lucy from the Local Storytelling Exchange for her remarks.
Thanks very much, Hayden. And I think you've got some slides of mine that if you could put up, that'd be great. Thanks, and thanks very much for inviting us on. It's really great to be talking about this subject. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into what Hayden talked about around the depth and quality of engagement. And I'm going to look at this specifically from the perspective of what does this look and feel like if you live in the areas where upgrades are happening? And I'm going to talk about the nuts and bolts, as Hayden said, the upgrading the grid. So pylons, substations and cables in particular. So anybody who's been anywhere along the East Coast where the grid upgrade is taking place will probably notice several things. One, that these are really beautiful places. The second is there is a shed load of development happening in these places all at once. So there's loads of house building going on, lots of solar being put in, and there are pylons, substations and cabling going in. The last thing that you'll notice is that wherever you look, you will probably see signs of local oppositions to pylons, to substations, placards lining roadways, in fields, banners hanging from houses. There is a lot of anger at the local level. And this is tricky because the grid upgrade needs to happen, like Hayden says, it needs to happen quickly. It's of national importance. Yet the impacts of this are really being felt locally. And it looks like people don't want it, or at least they don't want it in this way. So what does public engagement that we're talking about today look like when it lands in that kind of context? At the Exchange, we spent the last 18 months trying to understand that. And we did that by asking people themselves, what would a fair process look like? And we did several things in partnership with Sustainability First. We ran focus groups and a deliberation panel recruited from along the East Coast where upgrades are actually taking place or about to take place. We ran a whole year plus of in-depth narrative shaping and journalism where this issue is very contentious. And wrapping around that, we held an expert panel which included the 3 transmission operators that are responsible for delivering the upgrades to the grid. So playing back the findings to check against their reality. And there are 3 things that from this work that I want to share with you today. The first thing that Hayden talked a little bit about was why doing this better really, really matters. The second thing is there is a potential way through how we can do this a bit differently. And then I want to close with a couple of examples of where communities are navigating this themselves and what that looks like. So let's start with why this really, really matters. what happens on the ground in communities impacts, as Hayden pointed to, the speed of the delivery of the upgrades that are necessary for electrification, the space for public voice, and the broader consensus around net zero. So starting with the speed of delivery, in many places, the level of opposition that we saw is significant and very well organised. There are very legitimate questions and concerns with how this upgrade is being rolled out. And a lack of wide, early and decent engagement means that these go unanswered and unheard. And what that does is it creates a vacuum, which is then filled by suspicion and mistrust about both the process that's going to happen and the need for the upgrades. And this has material consequences to the speed of delivery. If you change slides, please, Hayden. In Scotland, for example, there are 4 key substations just this year that have had planning permission refused, with public opposition cited as a key concern. One of these received 10,000 objections. That's Scotland's largest response to an energy project. So that's a very material delay that's happening. But something else happens when there's this level of opposition. And that thing is that it closes the space, the public permission for discussion. And that closes down the space for a range of perspectives. And this is also quite serious. Hayden said that a number of people are not against this, but how do we surface those voices? When our team went to find a wider range of voices in areas where anger around renewables was high, they were stonewalled. Next slide, please, Hayden. Next slide. Back, please. Back to the quote. Thanks. So they were stonewalled. They came up against examples of people not wanting to put their head above the parapet for fear of what their neighbours were saying, not willing to speak out publicly, even if they held a different perspectives. And the consequences of this spill out wider than a particular development, where there were concerns and mistrust about the process crossed a wide range of people, including those who are pro-renewables or who would poll positively in climate action. And where there's space, the only spaces to convene around something are those of opposition, those spaces become filled both with the anger that is felt, but also we saw a level of misinformation coming up in those spaces. And that starts to impact people's broader consensus around action on climate and what they think is needed as a response. And it's in environments like this that the national messaging that's currently using doesn't seem to be connecting with how people are experiencing this on the ground and what their concerns really are. So the second thing I want to talk to is a potential way through. Can you change slides, please? Thank you. There are approaches that can shift the dial on how people engage and shape what happens in their area. And this looks like 2 things. Shifting the conversation away from talking about doing public engagement to asking how you want to be engaged. And shifting the conversation away from you'll get X community benefit to what is the ambition and vision you have for your area. In our focus groups and deliberation panel, we asked the question what a fair grid development process would mean to people. And this surfaced a range of viewpoints. We found that people fell broadly into 4 positions that offer us a way through what otherwise looks like a really sticky, messy situation. The good news is that of those 4 positions, the smallest of all was an immovable position in which there were no circumstances under which grid upgrades can be carried out fairly. So that tallies with what Hayden was saying about where the majority and the opinion sits. The other 3 positions that form the majority offer us a route towards a process that puts communities first, whilst also delivering the vital infrastructure. So this slide shows us the 3 positions. We have the first position up there is power to the people. The people in this group, they want local control. They want to be treated as partners, not obstacles. And they have high levels of ambition around community benefit, using this to address issues and needs at the local level. The second position, the pressing reasons to act, sees the grid upgrades as an imperative for their children's futures or for their country's prosperity. But this is conditional. They want the right information and the right process to convince them that proposals have been properly thought through and consulted on. And the third group is more about a transactional approach. They are interested in the compensation in return. So they felt that any compensation at either an individual or community level should be significantly higher than is currently being proposed. What this shows is that the majority of people are, go back one, Hayden, too soon, thanks. It shows that the majority of people are willing to engage in a process if certain conditions are met, but it's not a one size fits all. What's also important about this is that these positions are fragile. So across all groupings, if people felt like consultation or benefit was inadequate or at all tokenistic, then they were quickly willing to retract their support. And that's really key. So while hypothetically, such as you see in national polling, most people are not opposed to development, they will become opposed if they don't trust the process. So before closing, I wanted to just share a couple of examples that show a way through what doing this a bit differently looks like. So this is Chris Bruce on the left. He's the chair of East Lammermuir Community Council. That's just over the borders in Scotland. This community council has shifted from a position of blanket opposition to a position of building community power around grid development and insisting that that development happens in partnership with them. How did this happen? So they have been faced with 14 different applications. Back one, please, Hayden, too soon. They've been faced with 14 different applications. In the face of this, they decided to convene all the developers and the transmission operators for a public meeting. They convened this on their terms, inviting the developers to come to them and share their proposals. This led to a process of coordinated engagement and a willingness, both from the community and crucially from the developers, to find the best route through delivering the plans and keeping community interest at heart, at the centre of this. And crucially, there was a serious interest from both sides in what the local ambitions for the area were, leading to a shared aim to invest community benefit strategically. Not everybody welcomes this development, but the approach and the process has changed the conversation fundamentally. Next slide, please. At the other end of the country, this is down in the south, in Saxmundham in Suffolk. Here, there is highly vocal opposition to plans for the grid development. And yet in the midst of this opposition, some residents and the town council have developed a really ambitious community benefit vision called Empowering Nature. This sets out what the town would demand if grid connections come in. It's about restoring woodland, about having community-owned energy, a nature corridor, active travel routes. The town council opposes the development, but it's preparing for the possibility that permission is granted. And in making space for a twin track approach, so opposing whilst also planning for what if, has really shifted the social buy-in around this. It's also given the town council a negotiation tool and enabled them to have really constructive talks with National Grid, and which keeps local ambition at the forefront of those discussions. Next slide. So to wrap up, obviously projects of this scale are never going to please everybody, but they can be fairer and they can be more trusted. But to move forward, we're going to really need to be more ambitious about how we do this. And that means showing how community input shapes outcomes, like Hayden says, collaboration in place of consultation. So thinking of communities as partners, being seriously ambitious about leaving places better off than they were before, and allowing for places to challenge proposals whilst also engaging them in a process without being called names like NIMBYs and blockers. And I'm going to leave you with like the words, not of myself, but of Chris, who you saw earlier on, if you go to the last slide, because I think he sums this up really nicely. And if you're interested in finding out more, I'll drop a link in the chat to the deep dive that we've done, which has got some really great videos of the people in these places talking about this issue themselves. So do grab a cup of tea after this and sit down and watch that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Two really great examples to close on there that I think people, should check out, and really agree with your points around, this benefiting the community. That empowering nature, I think, is a really inspiring vision for how we can leave communities better off. And just to close then, before we move to questions, I'm going to invite Becca Massey-Chase from the IPPR to give some remarks now as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Hayden. And thank you, Hayden, for your opening comments as well, and to Lucy for that really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. Lucy zoomed in there into that community level. I'm going to zoom back out again and think a little bit more about the national picture, because one of the things that I was really thinking about as Lucy was talking was this idea of public's views not being set in stone, but being movable. By being, if certain conditions are created, then people's ideas, thoughts, opinions about things do change and they do move. And that's always for positive reasons, though. So sometimes they can be responding to external factors where there are, in fact, people with vested interests at a national level who are coming into communities and trying to influence people's opinions. And so to sort of set that scene of what some of the forces are that are at play, where people are coming into these communities and trying to kind of encourage opposition, I want to take a little bit of a step out and again consider that kind of national picture and the national kind of environment that's created kind of the conditions in which that's happening. So I'm going to share some slides. So at this point, you are now all super familiar with this idea that the public support net zero is something that Hayden talked about at the beginning, that there is this kind of broad background level of support. So I don't want to overstate that or take that for granted in any way, but I think it does bear repeating because we know that there is this this storyline about a sort of net zero backlash and public opposition to net zero. So I think it does bear repeating that actually, in actual fact, there is broad support across voter groups for net zero. So you'll see this, I'm going to sort of take a bit more of a political angle here. You can see here that really every group is above that zero line, including people who voted Labour at the last election who are now considering voting reform. They're still above that like zero line. So there is still net support for net zero amongst that group. That's a group that is being exposed to quite a lot of anti-net zero narratives. The only voter group where there is that clear opposition is that group of voters who voted for reform in 2024, where you can see that that support is very, that is opposition. But overall, across all the other groups, we're seeing it, and overall, the kind of like collective is that there is support for net zero. That overall support sits at about 60% on average, which is a comfortable majority. It's obviously not a strong endorsement. So that's the sort of a bit of the setting the scene of where the public's at. The story about net zero being this kind of very contested space is very much in the kind of elite space. It's in the political space. And it's good to break down that a little bit as well. So what you can see in these two graphs is that the Conservatives have really lost their support for net zero. And you can see that kind of real plummeting line and the green line shooting downwards and a blue opposition line is shooting upwards for Conservatives since the general election. For Labour MPs, that's not the same. That stays as a sort of fairly steady high green line. But what you will see is if you look to the right of this, is that the line really plummets downwards when we're thinking about the electoral advantage of strong climate policy. So to the left, support for net zero hasn't dropped, but the belief that it's something that voters want to see has dropped. And there's a range of reasons for that. And one is something that Hayden already mentioned, which is around the kind of media hostility, which I think could be part of the reason why MPs significantly underestimate public support for net zero. So we know that about 57% of Labour MPs, for example, underestimate support. So that's a climate barometer stat. And these graphs are from some new research, and they show that negativity towards net zero is 160% higher in the UK news media than among the public. So we've got political opposition and we've got media opposition. And it's worth, I think, considering kind of where that's coming from. Now, of course, there will be maybe some more cynical takes and some less cynical takes. There may be genuine kind of political rationale. So, some people to the right of politics may have been kind of influenced by stories that suggest that this kind of stuff is more of a kind of globalist imposition, or people who have a kind of anxiety about being too stringent in kind of dictating how people like live their lives and things like that, seeing it as kind of net zero as a kind of example of government overreach. So there may be some kind of political kind of stories that make sense of this. There's also, we can look at, and DeSmog are really good at this, at looking at kind of where does various funding come from and where do allegiances lie, etc. So there's a kind of background story as to why and kind of how this has happened. But I think it's really important to be aware of that kind of national picture, because what we've kind of got there in terms of what that's created is this situation where people generally support net zero, but they don't think it will be achieved. So even people who think that net zero is a good thing expect that we will not achieve this goal. It's a really, really, really low level of confidence in net zero being achieved. And that isn't that surprising when we think about the situation of kind of a general low level of trust from the public towards politicians being able, and the sort of institutions that are designed to serve them, being able to deliver on their promises, being able to do the things that they say they'll do. 87% of Britons have either not very much trust in politicians or none at all. About 3/4 of people believe that the government doesn't have things under control. So this is the kind of situation that we're faced with. And that's going to have an impact on all policy areas. This isn't just net zero and climate policy this impacts. It impacts all policy areas, but I think there's something specific about climate policy which makes it really vulnerable in this context, because a lot of the benefits that come to people in terms of security, energy security, and in terms of sort of achieving the reduction in climate impacts, etc., that they want to see happen, it's all quite far down the road. If you don't believe that the people who are in charge are going to be able to deliver, it's quite hard to sort of trust that long-term stuff is going to happen. So there's that. And then also, it's a big and systemic and tricky challenge. It's difficult, it feels overwhelming. So again, that context of low confidence and low trust is particularly difficult for that. And therefore, so as part of our research recently, we've tested a number of anti-net zero narratives, a number of anti-net zero stories that the public will have been exposed to and have heard, for their reach, their believability, what people think about them. And overall, it's a positive story, because we found that broadly speaking, most of the arguments being made against net zero really weren't landing with the public. People didn't buy them, and they preferred the pro net zero stories. The story that really landed and really resonated with people was the idea that it was unrealistic. It was asking for sweeping changes that politicians promise, but they can't deliver. And I think there's something here that's a really important learning point for all of us, which is about people look for and want stories that make like emotional sense of their lives. So if their lives are hard and difficult, then stories that tell them why that's happening, or stories that speak to that difficulty, those sorts of stories make sense to people. And we are all complicated. We all hold a whole range of different thoughts and opinions and views. And some of them are consistent, some of them are coherent, some of them aren't. So I think assuming that we're all kind of entirely rational isn't always a good idea. And so thinking about what's the emotional resonance is really important. And this story resonates with people because they feel like things feel a bit hopeless, or things feel a bit hard, things feel like they're not being achieved, life isn't getting better. And so these sorts of stories then make sense to people. But how people feel isn't set in stone. It's movable, it's changeable. And actually there's a role, I think, in terms of climate policy, in terms of renewable energy infrastructure, in actually tackling some of those feelings. So clearly not the responsibility of just this area of policy for doing that, but actually there is something about providing a opportunity to see positive things happen. Now we know that there is broad support for renewable energy infrastructure, and so people seeing things happening that they feel like is stuff that they want to happen and they support a good thing, and it helps that kind of build trust through proof of competence. It's something that people support, even, you know, people who've voted reform, who are more exposed to more anti-net zero messaging, they like renewable energy. So I think it's a good kind of overall point that there's this kind of need to deliver. If the public see policy being delivered on, that's really helpful. And fair and effective policies being delivered, that's all really helpful for tackling that national mood and tackling some of these stories. And there's an opportunity in delivering on renewable energy infrastructure to do that. So when I've put there about fair and effective policies, I think it does raise that question over what is fair, what's fairness. And our research suggests that generally it's easier to say what's not fair than what is fair. People find it easier to kind of point to examples of injustice and unfairness than they do to sort of positively define it. And actually, fairness means a whole range of different things to different people, and it can be just a bit of a proxy for overall acceptability. So there'd be some people who would say nothing could make that fair about net zero or about energy infrastructure, for example. So if you have a kind of more left-wingy type view about fairness, you might think about it in one way. Right-wingy view might think about it in another. So it is quite a broad concept. But one thing that we found through our research was that there was a kind of definition of fairness that felt really helpful to this particular question about the kind of clean energy transition, and that is about legibility and understanding what it means. So people feel like if they don't kind of know how things are going to pan out, or they're not really sure that they understand something, then there's an increased feeling of like threat and uncertainty. And actually, if something makes sense and they can predict the outcomes better, then that really reduces that feeling of kind of anxiety and threat, and that increases the degree to which they might think it's fair. Now, they may not agree with all of the way that everything goes, but if they can at least understand it and predict what's going to happen, that really helps with that issue of fairness. And I think that's a really important thing to think about when we think about how we engage communities, and coming back to that more local community level, about really increasing that, kind of, if people understand what I mean by legibility of the policy, or legibility of the thing that's happening, the kind of predictability, the understandability of it, that feels really helpful, and something or kind of all of us to bear in mind. And then this other point about getting kind of the big why and kind of getting the climate impacts up the agenda, people understanding the context in which something is happening. So there's I think some really important research that suggests that people, when we think about kind of net zero and the clean energy transition, people are alert to like cost and inconvenience, and whether or not something might make their life a bit trickier or might cost them more, and that can be a way that their kind of approval of something goes down or up if it's going to make their life better. But I think we can be at risk of overstating that, because actually there's lots of research that shows that people are also prepared to bear some cost in kind of whatever form, whether that's financial cost or inconvenience, etc., for something that they really care about, for tackling the climate crisis is something that people care about, and there's specific research that shows that people are prepared to bear some costs for that. And so in terms of it kind of improving people's what we would call like the salience of the issue, increasing the salience of the issue, so how important something is to people. And if something's important to people, they're much less likely to respond to like elite cues. So for example, if there are actors coming into the community who have a vested interest in trying to mobilize opposition, or if there are newspapers writing really inflammatory headlines about something, people are much less moved by those things if it's an issue that they personally really kind of care about. So we know there's a potential for people to care about it. It's dropped a little bit in recent times, understandably. But one way you can get that salience up, the amount that people care about it, is by getting climate impacts up the agenda, by talking about extreme weather, by talking about the local impacts on flooding and extreme heat, and intuitively people get that, they understand and they care about those things. So I think there's also something about like situating all of this within that kind of big why. And then at this local level, and this is something that others have talked about more, so I'll talk a bit less about, but again, Climate Barometer have done some really good research into what drives support for local energy infrastructure, and their research shows that people are in kind of general agreement from all different walks of life, or in general agreement on their top priorities, and they want like in terms of the sort of factors that sort of kind of are needed for their consent, they want local communities to be involved, and they want clear plain language information about a project and its impacts. They want to be asked for their views early before decisions are made. They want, for the public want a clear explanation for how their views influence the final decision, and MPs want it to be an independent or trusted organisation running the process for the public. And those were the kinds of conditions, and they're all very similar to what people have spoken about already. And those are the kinds of conditions that we need. So I guess that's my kind of overall point, really, is that the context that we understand is that there's general support for this stuff. People do oppose things for both like reasons of their own making, things that they personally care about, so things like the kind of changes to landscape and nature and things that people are worried about. But sometimes people's opposition is encouraged by external forces coming in and trying to mobilize opposition. At the same time, there are other factors that can support and increase support for these things and raise those voices of the support that there is out there, and doing the processes well and delivering them right are, you know, crucial to maintaining and increasing support. So that's that's the 2 pennies worth, and I shall stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Becca. There was so much in there to unpack, and I think your points around fairness, I think the thing I've taken away from our discussion is really trying to visualize how communities will be benefited from all of this, and it is a really hard area to kind of articulate and communicate and visualize how a community will be better off. But I was even thinking about Lucy's, you know, the empowering nature proposal, really at that place by place level. We can zoom out, we can think about climate impacts and the big picture support, but actually there's so many things happening in local context that are trying to demonstrate the benefits of it. And we actually asked people about your point around, you know, are people willing to bear some of the costs and understand some of the costs associated? There is actually increasingly it's not a majority, but there is a portion of society who understand that by reaching net zero clean energy by 2030, you know, there is support, even if that meant a short-term increase in bills for some people. There is still about 43% of people, when we surveyed, said they would be willing to bear that. So it is worth bearing in mind that you know, and I think not learning the wrong lessons from the kind of hostile, perhaps, media environment that we're in on all of this. So we've run slightly over, but we do have a bit of time for questions. So please do keep some questions coming in the chat, and we'll try and take those. There was an initial question from Peter around sort of net zero and how we communicate that. And maybe do we need to lean into more of this around, you know, future generations? And we've done quite a lot of work on this at Climate Outreach. And I'd encourage you to look at our Britain Talks Climate and Nature Research, which we have a comms toolkit as part of that, which gives you some lessons on how to communicate. And actually, this framing around for the future and future generations, I think, does work very well for the segment of society that we know as the rooted patriot segment. This is a segment who is you know, often found in kind of former red wall areas, and is maybe quite distrusting of our politics, but generally is very proud of their local environments, wants to do best by their family. So this kind of thinking about net zero as better for future generations. I'd also say we presented a kind of hypothetical council target about reaching net zero by 2040, I think the target was, or 2045, and it only got about 45% of support when you just state the target. But obviously then presenting that vision of what net zero is trying to achieve, better livelihoods, cleaner air, you know, cleaner rivers, cheaper energy supply, more secure energy supply, all that, presenting that vision underneath this net zero term, obviously then inevitably increases the support, and we found increased support by like 25% doing that. There was a question as well for Lucy this kind of engagement exercises that you've talked about, and the kind of range of things happening in East Lammermuir and Saxmundham. How much does that add to the costs, and who pays for this? And like, how much can, you know, grid operators and generators, how much can they be expected to do, I guess, in the kind of face of local pressures? Or how much can they be expected to do in terms of this engagement?
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that question, Peter. So having a public engagement process and delivering community benefits is a requirement of transmission operators as part of the grid upgrade. So it is there on the table already. And I think Hayden, in the research that Climate Outreach did, that Hayden talked about, that research looks at the economic cost of not doing this well through the delays. And I think Hayden stated a sort of 12-month delay around caused by poor public engagement. And in my presentation, I highlighted substations that were on appeal that had been refused by local councils, with community opposition cited as one of the reasons for that refusal. So those substations are now in an appeal process with the energy developers. So that is a highly costly and protracted process. So I can't give you figures on this, but I think when you look at those two costs between what happens when you don't do this well and what happens if you can find another way, it would be very interesting. I also think it's a really good question around how flexible, especially when we're not talking about a solar farm, which could go in this field or this field. We're talking about a whole infrastructure which needs to go from A, B, C to D. And so how flexible can grid operators afford to be? I think one of the things that came back so solidly from all of our research and our engagement work was treat us like grown-ups. And we heard that phrase over and over again from people. It's like, we are grown-ups. We can understand whether something needs to go here or here, but give us the information, tell us what this is going to look like, why these decisions are being made, why and whether you are taking on board our concerns, and why you're making the decisions after listening to that. So I think it's that engagement process that is so critical to whether you carry people along, whether you're treating them as partners in this process, or whether you are trying to get them on side, and the point is to get them on side. And I think, you know, that sort of makes me think a lot about this question of fairness that Becca raised, and what does fair actually look like? And if you have a look at the deep dive that we've done on this, then that's the very question that we ask people themselves: what does fair look like? And those 4 positions that I talked about was after hours and hours of discussion and a very highly technical Q-sort process that showed there are 4 positions that people will broadly hold, and for each of those positions fairness looks different. And so the kind of so what the compensation for that is, it can be different. So some people are motivated by that higher order, other people by compensation, etc. But I think that what comes out of all of this is that it is the process that is key, and working with people to deliver something.
Thanks, Lucy. Really, really helpful. There's quite a few questions coming in now, so apologies, we probably won't get to all of these. Lily, your question on community benefit funds, yeah, we've obviously got the government kind of principles on that, and I know many sort of energy networks like Scottish Power are doing a lot of good work on that. I think I'd also say, Becca said something quite personal, I think, about, you know, how do people actually understand what this will look like and what the benefit will be? And I think that is still potentially a problem with the community benefit funds. I do think these proposals, I think that empowering nature one is really, really important. So having that more kind of visual or just easily communicated or presented kind of benefit for the community, it's not always clear, I think, for people what that's going to be. And we know that skepticism of renewable projects increases if people feel like they won't, you know, feel the benefits for their bills. So that is really, really important to get that right. Rose has a question on language. Rose, I'd encourage you to check out our climate communications toolkit, which is called Britain Talks Climate and Nature, which is on our Climate Outreach's website, because we know that often this kind of catastrophizing language is not always that helpful, but presenting the vision of how and the progress in particular that we're making, really, really important. And questions around landowners. Lucy, I don't know if there's anything from Saxmundham on that one about tenant farmers or engagement with kind of agricultural sectors potentially for that you might be able to share there, but no worries if not. No. Yes, and we also work quite closely in partnership with Involve, and they are releasing a piece of research, Paul, yes, about the costs of inaction. And I think that's something that we are trying to work to influence government on, is showing that there is actually a cost of not engaging, basically, and that research really, really vital. I'm just going to bring us to a close now. I'm going to just share my screen with a few upcoming things that we have from Climate Outreach. Hopefully you can see this. So just to close, I want to say thank you very much for engaging with us today. We hope you found it really, really helpful. And the link on the screen there, our Britain Talks Climate and Nature research, which gives you a lot of understanding, not just of where the public are and sort of fleshing out some of the data as well that can be found in IPPR's report, but also a communications toolkit, which we'd encourage you to look at. We have an offer of a workshop offer for individual workshops, which are taking place in July, which individuals can sign up to. You can find that on the training and events section of our website. And I'd also encourage you to look at our climate visuals library as well. So we've heard a lot today about, importance of good engagement, and I think the visual component is something that's often overlooked, but actually this is something that really does help people to understand the benefits of renewable energy and the transition that we're all working towards. So yes, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to our brilliant speakers, and have a lovely rest of your day.